Welcome to this special edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. We are dealing with multiple crises right now. Protests for racial injustice and the coronavirus pandemic are impacting the entire world. On top of that, yet another challenge. We're talking about education. In the Seattle School District and districts across the state, they are working to finish this school year and figure out how to start again in the fall. COVID-19 forced the closure of schools across Washington state in mid-March, and for our 1.1 million students, they have not opened since. Families are concerned. Some students have been able to access the online classes that teachers are working so hard to provide. Some have not. So are students falling behind? And when schools do reopen, how can administrators keep students, teachers, and staff healthy and safe? We have assembled a panel of guests here to talk about these issues, including Chris Reykdal. He is the State Superintendent of Public Instruction. We also have with us Denise Juneau. She is the Superintendent of the Seattle School District. And for a student's perspective, we have Margarita Amezcua. She is finishing up her junior year at Auburn Riverside High School. She is also a student representative on the State Board of Education, one of two who are selected statewide. And Margarita, let me start with you here. Online classes are a very different learning experience. I know because I have a few kids at home that are doing this as well. You've been focused on junior year. You're trying to go to college a year from now. I know I'm talking with you about that. So tell us what these past months have been like for you, and tell us any concerns you might have about your education and the statewide system.
For me, it's been very difficult because I'm much more of a talk to me, explain to me everything very thoroughly kind of person. And online, there's only so much you can do online. Teachers are trying their best, but it's very difficult personally.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Superintendent Reykdal, I know this is very much uncharted territory for you and for schools all around the world here, but I want to assess how the state has dealt with this crisis so far. Get your take on that. There was a poll a few weeks ago from the Education Trust that showed 86% of parents in our state were worried their students were falling behind. There are additional concerns, as you know, for English as a second language students, special education students too. So tell me about what the data is you're seeing and what you're hearing from parents, students, and teachers about how our state K-12 system is responding to this crisis.
Yeah, we're certainly looking at as much information as we can within our state. And that same poll looked at some other states with a really consistent trend across the country. Of course, all the states closed their schools. Yep. 53 million kids out of school and 1.6 billion worldwide. So I think our observation is everyone has a real nervousness about that. That tells you how much they're invested and how much they value education. Some of what we relate to them, of course, is while it's been a relatively inconsistent experience depending on where you live, everyone's out of school. And we were a state that chose continuous learning while others just completely shut down. So on a relative basis, of course, our kids are certainly keeping up or exceeding other states, but it's not where we wanted them to be even 4 months ago. Thus our effort here to try to get schools open this fall, re-engage students this summer, have very individual plans for those who need it, and really engage students and help them catch up where it's necessary. But we got to get our schools open. That's the priority now.
Yeah, and we'll touch on that opening issue in just a little bit. But Superintendent Juneau, I know concerns over equity, making sure all kids have the same opportunity to learn, are definitely a concern in Seattle, the largest district in the state. I want to touch on this issue, your assessment of the district's response to COVID-19. I know some local big tech companies have donated laptops to students, et cetera, but do all Seattle kids have them? Can they all access these online classes? I know that's a big concern.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we learned very quickly was how inequitable our access to technology and internet really was in this city. There needs to be a huge push for broadband for all. If we are going to stay in this mode or a mixed mode of learning and where we're part remote or the virus spikes again and we have to be online again, there has to be a huge movement across this city, this region, this state, and this country really to look at broadband for all. The idea that internet access is not available to all across this, especially Seattle, is really horrendous. And it led to exacerbating a lot of the inequities that were in our system. And so going forward, I mean, we can provide as many devices as we can, but we really need to make sure that people have access at home.
Superintendent Reykdal, I want to make sure I follow up with you about that, about the online access part. And also, if you could touch on this idea of do no harm, the policy you've advised when it comes to grading students. Seattle, for example, giving out grades of A or incomplete to its high schoolers this spring. I know I've heard this concern from parents. There have been some researchers at the UW talking about this too. Being forgiving on grades could possibly do some harm academically to kids in the long term from younger kids to college bound. Tell us about that policy and if that might continue into the fall.
Yeah, our focus here on the whole concept was that we knew some students weren't getting equitable access to learning. And it was such a shock to close the system so rapidly upon the governor's orders. So our concept of do no harm, of course, was primarily focused on high school students and GPAs, but not allowing Fs to be issued.
Okay.
Instead, districts were given permission to, adopt a grading scale that made more sense to them. But an F wasn't an option, and moving a kid backwards in their grade because they couldn't make a connection was not an option. And instead, where a teacher didn't feel that a student was able to demonstrate, mastery against standards, an incomplete was the option. And therefore, it challenged the system to re-engage that student. Instead of saying, hey, you got an F, too bad it hurt your GPA, try the next class. There's an obligation to go back and help that individual catch up with learning and get a grade that's more effective. So that was the concept. Districts still had flexibility and some local control. And as you observed around the region, they picked, slightly different scales.
Mm-hmm.
No Fs, no backsliding on grades, and an incomplete was the option for students who couldn't demonstrate standard.
Yeah. Does that have an impact on how kids are getting into college? I have a student who's a junior myself, and there's been some concern in my household certainly about it. How do you rationalize that piece of it, moving to the next level for those students moving on to college?
Yeah, the higher ed system specifically asked us to put a notation on transcripts this year. They just said it's a strange year. It's an unbelievable year. It's obviously faced by the country and certainly in our state. And what they wanted is a historical record so they could go in and say, yeah, here's a marcation about a student grade. What district were they in? What courses did they take?
Yeah.
It seems obvious for a senior, they're going to school next year, but there are eighth graders in our system, right? Even some younger, but some eighth graders taking high school level work. And 4 or 5 years from now, higher ed said, we want to make sure we understand the context of that moment. Higher ed's going to do a great job, and our students are going to get access, and they're going to be very, very effective. But it does shine the light on how inequitable even grading practices are. And we need to move to standards, and we need to get away from sort of punitive systems that are really judging kids on the volume of homework they do instead of their success against standards.
That's a great point. And I know there's a whole nother show that we could talk about with that one. Margarita, maybe I can ask you that question about the grades and how they've been handed out this year. You're a junior, you're thinking about college. Your thoughts about how the grades were distributed this spring?
Yeah, I think my school isn't specific. I think did a really great job with that because obviously so many kids don't have access to the things that we need in order to succeed with this online learning. But yeah, for us, it was more like your grade can't go down. It can only go up and things like that. But seeing other schools and kind of comparing how they're being graded and everything, I think it does make, from what I've been hearing with my friends and everything, it does make us kind of nervous because some schools have just given that A, which is completely, I understand it, but it is like when thinking about applying to colleges, like how are we going to be compared to other students if we want to go and we've been trying to do work, or how that's going to be compared. But yes, I think that's where the worry goes.
A lot of concern for our higher education system, as you heard Superintendent Reykdal bring up. I want to move on to some more ideas about how to deal with the COVID crisis in the fall in our education system as schools do begin to reopen. This will not be business as usual. I think everybody is aware of that. We are recording the show just a few days before the state plans to put out some new guidance on what reopening should look like. So to begin, Margarita, I'll stay with you. What health measures do you want to see at your school and others? Do you want to see temperature checks at the door, or what would make you and your family feel safe about coming back to class?
I think that could be answered in a lot of different ways. What I've heard is, temperature checks, masks, things like that. But I think we're all just hoping to come back in some way. And I think we all understand that it's going to be different. But I think what we're all focused on is just trying to get there and see what happens with that. But yeah, we've heard temperature checks, masks, different schedules. Some people go this day, others don't. That's what we've been hearing. Yeah.
Okay. Superintendent Reykdal, I'll go to you next year, and I'm focusing on this health piece because I think there's a lot more to this than people might be considering. Getting students back to class is a social and emotional health priority, definitely. There's also the physical health issues, of course, around coronavirus. So help us to look at the whole picture here, the whole person. How will the state plan to reopen schools to keep students and teachers healthy? Can you give us some insight on that in a general sense?
Yeah, our state Department of Health, in partnership with our local health authorities, are really the drivers of what it is going to require to keep our kids safe and healthy, as well as our educators in the system. They've learned a lot since this started, and there's a pile more research and data that they have behind them. And I think they feel confident we can do this very effectively. Department of Labor and Industries, for example, has regulation to make sure that our employees are safe from that standpoint. That partnership together has us very close to guidance. As you've indicated, its priority emphasis will be on reopening our schools with proper safety protocols. And as Margarita said, it's hygiene practices. It's also masks. It is sort of a screening, but with a lot of flexibility, quite frankly. And then it's an understanding that it may be the case that once we open, a school may need to shut down very, very short term or longer. And so we'll challenge districts to have calendars prepared to still get in all the learning days next year, even if they miss some days, kind of like snow days. And if they're forced to miss a lot of traditional days face to face, then they need better synchronous online learning. And we've been growing in that. And we've seen growth in all of the districts. And so our goal here is to give districts the choice on how to do this well, but there will be health guidelines that frame what their options are.
Got it. And Superintendent, I know just like the state, you've had some work groups going at this, students, community staff, working out some of these different possible scenarios. How do you envision reopening schools this fall in a way that keeps students, teachers, and staff safe and healthy? Because I've heard from a lot of concerned teachers about this specifically who might not be all that comfortable about going back to class.
Yeah, well, we will definitely be working with our labor partners in all of this. And as Superintendent Reykdal pointed out, we will have to lead with public health advice and sort of which phase Seattle will be in at that point. I mean, there are so many uncertainties and unknowns. So we are planning, and we have these work groups that are coming together to help guide some of that decision making. We have students on those work groups, community, families, our labor partners. And so it's been really robust. And I think what's important about those work groups is our community members and our students are helping to guide how we are going to look, but also are able to sort of peel back the onion, because every time you think of one issue, it leads to 7 other cascading issues. And so really about how complicated and complex the idea of reopening is and whatever scenario it is. But first and foremost, our priority is going to be the health and safety of our staff and our students. And so we will be watching the public health and continue to working with our public health partners very closely.
Thank you very much for that. In terms of the quality of the education that you will receive in the fall, and Margarita, I'll start with you here. What's that going to be like? A possible combination of online learning and at-school days? How do you see that impacting your education going forward?
Yeah, I think that's making all of us nervous because obviously how we handled this first part of like, oh, okay, online learning, what are we going to do? Figuring that whole thing out. I feel like I definitely missed out on a big chunk of education that I needed. But I'm grateful that now we know we're going to have this summertime to kind of get everything going again, because if we do have to end up going back to online learning, that's going to be a whole nother part of the year that we're going to need to learn things. But yeah, as far as that goes, it's just kind of figuring out where you're going to get all that information, how you're going to have to adapt to getting all of that. But yes, that's
a lot still ahead there. I know that. And maybe I can jump over to you, Superintendent Juneau. If we are still going to have at least some need for online learning in the fall, do you think you'll be able to get any more resources over the summer to improve those services? I know in talking with you, the district has spent a lot of money on Wi-Fi hotspots, for example, things of that nature. Do you have the budget to sustain that into the fall?
Well, we will have to find it. I mean, that's one of the things that we'll be working, I know, with Superintendent Reykdal about as the legislature rolls around too, is there's going to have to be a really deep conversation about how we're going to support schools through this effort and on all the unforeseen costs that districts had to bear throughout this closure. We also surveyed our families and staff around online learning and how it's going currently. And so we will have a good idea of the gaps that we need to fill. But of course, all that professional development to make sure that our students are quality, or our teachers are able to provide quality online learning, because we know we'll be in that mode off and on, is all going to take some dollars. And so we'll be working closely with our delegation, with OSPI, with our state legislature, because if we're going to do this right, because as Margarita is asking us to, and students across the state are asking us to get better at what we are delivering, it's going to cost some dollars. It's going to take some dollars.
Superintendent Reykdal, I'll head to you next because I know you've heard these concerns from Seattle and other districts too when it comes to providing an adequate budget for these added services here. Does the state need to convene a special session to find more funding for schools?
Well, the first thing we got to do is make sure they don't come back in a special session and reduce any budgets. The first thing we have to do is preserve all these things they've done to make investments. And it's been a great bipartisan bit of work for the last 3 years. So we've got to preserve that. We have federal dollars on the line right now, $200 million that can get to our districts to help purchase that technology and to purchase that PPE and all those supports for students. And they're waiting on those dollars, and we're waiting for approval on those dollars. So that's a good positive first step. Preserve what we have, let districts use the existing money more flexibly, get them additional federal resources. And then, yeah, as Superintendent Juneau mentions, be aligned and resolute in the need to serve students effectively. And I would suggest that austerity at this time is actually the most inequitable approach to budgets we could have. It's never been effective, and certainly not in this moment we're in today, where we know how to double down more effectively on students who need it the most. So we'll be battling for additional resource in this time, not this old historic game of go ahead and let's presume a cut. Cuts are inequitable.
Yeah, well, I know you've been a legislator yourself in the state, so I appreciate your insight on that one, Chris. I have to say, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the impact the worldwide protests for racial justice are having on education right now. Many students and teachers are actually taking part in some of the protests that we were seeing. Margarita, I want to touch on this. In talking to you, I know you're really concerned about equity in our school system. What impact do you think these protests are having or should have on education? Could you talk to me about that?
Oh, yes, definitely. I feel like we're all watching right now. We have all this time to, obviously, we have school and things, but right now we have all this time that we've never had before to just kind of sit and kind of intake every information that comes out. But these protests are, I think, very important to be witnessing right now. I think we're all being made aware of injustices that a lot of us just go by every day without even considering. As soon as some of us get off social media, it goes back to normal. But there's things that people have to deal with every day that they can't ignore this. So I think making these protests known and being everywhere on media, I think that is very important because some people have never even considered these things. And I think they're very important. I'm grateful that even though, yes, health and everything, it's dangerous, so many people in one place, but at the end of the day, these are human lives we're talking about. So yeah, I think they should be playing a part in this education.
And Superintendent Reykdal, dealing with racial inequalities when it comes to student achievement, graduation rates, disciplinary issues in schools, the list really goes on. This is a concern for all educators here. How do you think these protests about racial injustice will impact how our state teaches its children going forward?
Well, it's going to change us, and it's needed to change us. And fortunately, those who are bringing the biggest spotlight to this are helping the public understand it's not just a question of police brutality and the conflicts between our communities of color and law enforcement. That is a symptom of a much, much deeper racist system that's been institutionalized for a very long period of time, and education is not exempt from that. And as you mentioned, our discipline practices were clearly, by evidence, racially disproportionate. And we've addressed those after 40 years. Now, that's hard work. You can change a policy, but it's years and years to really make it systemic. And the hard work falls on our districts. And we've got districts like Seattle and Highline and others who have been leading on this work. But it's the hard work, but it's the right conversation. And it's very much a blessing that people who, as Margarita said, maybe have been able to ignore this can't any longer. Our challenge is to not lose the moment and not let it be isolated to just the police brutality, but to find every aspect of our economy that continues to perpetuate systemic racism. And I'll be talking a lot more about that later this week in some of my remarks, but this is a beautiful moment, ironically as that sounds, to elevate this question and to make the question permanent in our work.
Thank you for that. And Superintendent Juneau, I want to make sure that we point out, you've made racial equity work a top priority in your job as superintendent of Seattle Public Schools. Right now, you're in the middle of some big challenges when it comes to changing Seattle's highly capable system, as it's called, for advanced learners. I want to talk about the message you might be drawing from these protests we're seeing in Seattle when it comes to this hard work, as Superintendent Reykdal pointed out, this hard work of confronting racial inequities in our institutions.
Yeah, I mean, for me right now, students are leading. It's young people that are holding these protests and are demanding that we do the hard work of our organizations of becoming anti-racist, of breaking down the legacies of racism that have historically been ever present. I attended a student-led protest not too long ago, and it was just nice to see young people leading. And it is now our opportunity and our time to listen to them. Um, and I think that if we do not take this opportunity right now that is present to kind of redo grading practices, how we come back, if we do not center the voices of students of color furthest from educational justice in this time, it's shame on us. We have to come back and seismically shift how we do the business of school. And we have now, with the COVID closures, with the heaviness and weight that's coming from the racial divides and our organizations, it's a time that we take this opportunity to really come back in a way that centers the students that we have always pushed aside. And so it's time for us to do that. And that's how I feel about the protests that are going on and all the activism that's happening is, and you know, Margarita's right. It's like, it is not time to just show up on social media. We need to show up as our authentic selves in these leadership roles and really do the hard work to make sure that racial equity is at the core of everything we're doing.
Thank you very much for that. We need to start wrapping up the show here. Margarita, last question. Some final thoughts on what is next. What are some of the main things you want to advocate for when it comes to our state education system as we slowly emerge from the coronavirus crisis? Any new ideas like year-round school or any other thoughts you want lawmakers to consider?
Yes, I think I talked to you about this earlier. Yeah, as people have presented to me the idea of online or all year school to kind of catch up on the major education that we're missing out. But I want to kind of take it back to the activism that's going on right now. I think that's the biggest takeaway that any student wants lawmakers to hear. I think we're all very aware of what's going on in our society right now. And I think we want lawmakers to be aware of that too. When you're making decisions for people that are in classrooms every day, that experience these injustices every single day, it's important to remember that you might be one of the people that gets to ignore it whenever you want. So I think that's the thing that any student right now would ask of lawmakers, to be aware of the injustices and to take into account the things that come with it, that the biggest changes are made in the classrooms. The way teachers treat us are seen, and that comes with laws. So just being aware that recognizing our cultural differences and our racial differences is an important factor, and you can't just ignore that when you make decisions. But yeah, I think that's the biggest thing.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Superintendent Juneau, some final words for students, families, staff, and teachers about what they should expect to see this fall in our schools, what you would like to see this fall in our schools.
Yeah, well, we will continue working with our work groups on several different models that we're kind of thinking about. Of course, we would love to be back in person as much as possible. And so depending on how the public health advice is coming out at that time, but we will have some contingencies. We plan to communicate early and be as transparent as possible in our deliberations because our communities deserve that. But I think it's important to know that, for everybody to know that as we are considering making all these considerations and decisions, we need to take the lead from students. And so they are definitely involved in our decision-making groups. They have a place and we make space for their voice always. And we want to make sure that when we come back, that one, people are safe and healthy, but two, that we are delivering instruction in a way that is quality, and three, that it is centered on racial equity, because that is what young people are demanding.
I think so too. Superintendent Reykdal, I'm going to give you the last word here. In the midst of battling institutional racism, a worldwide pandemic, major economic challenges, how important is it to get schools back online and to do that right?
It's everything with respect to the opportunity, right? And your point is well made, to do it well and do it effectively. So you don't just come back for the sake of coming back. It's got to be student-centric. It's got to focus on their health and the health of our staff. But we've built systems of support in schools that were just sort of instantly vanished when we went online. I've said from the beginning, online is a modality and it works for some students, particularly in high school and college. It's not the modality. It's not the goal. It's a tool. So we need to come back healthy and safe, but face-to-face is the priority. We are working to make that the priority. But as we've talked about through the duration of the program, it's also about coming back different. How will we focus resources with much more attention where they need to go? How will we change practices that have systemically denied students opportunity? And that's everything from focusing on standards to the grading practices to additional student supports. And my role in part will be to tell the legislature this is not a moment right now to do budget cuts as usual. It's a moment of investment. And if you've seen anything over the last 2 weeks that should just frustrate people, it's 39 million people unemployed as stock markets hit record highs. There is a tremendous injustice in the United States around our economic systems, and it's time to address that, to address equity in schools and other parts of our economy.
Okay, thank you so much, all of you, for your input here. A great discussion here. We do have a number of resources available for you. You can check them out at seattle.gov from the superintendent's office, from Seattle Public Schools as well. Make sure you learn more at seattle.gov. Take care of yourself and stay healthy. I'm Brian Callanan. Thank you for joining us here on City Inside Out. We'll see you next time on Seattle Channel.